The soup was off. That was the first thing that didn't fit. When Kenneth Voss called the Duluth Police Department at 9:47 on the evening of November 5, 1999, to report that his business partner Dennis Halvorsen had not answered calls since that afternoon, and that Voss had stopped by the house on London Road and found the front door unlocked. He mentioned the soup. He mentioned it specifically. He said, "There was a pot on the stove. Looks like he was making something, but the burner was off. Like he stepped out for just a minute." The responding officer noted it in his report. Stove burner off. Pot present. No food burning. A detail that could mean many things. Dennis had gone out briefly. Dennis had turned off the stove before leaving. Dennis had been in the middle of cooking, and something had interrupted him, but he had been organized enough, even in an interruption, to turn off the flame. The detail that nobody asked for 25 years. Who turns off the burner when someone disappears? The answer to that question was in the house the whole time. Sealed inside a wall in the basement, in a plastic container behind a section of drywall that looked, to anyone who glanced at it, like any other section of drywall in any other basement in any other house on the western shore of Lake Superior. It waited 25 years for a renovation crew to remove it. When they did, the house gave up everything. But before we get to what was in that wall, you have to understand what was lost when Dennis Halvorsen did not come home from wherever he had supposedly gone. You have to understand who Dennis was, and what the house on London Road meant, and why the soup being turned off was the first sentence of a story that took a quarter-century to finish. Duluth sits at the western tip of Lake Superior, a city that climbs the hillside above the water with the particular verticality of a place that was built around a port, and had to accommodate itself to geography rather than the other way around. In November, Lake Superior becomes something else entirely. Not the blue inland sea of summer postcards, but a gray and white thing, enormous and indifferent, sending weather up the hillside without asking permission. The houses on London Road, which runs along the lake's edge, had storm windows and heavy curtains, and the kind of insulation that residents installed not as a comfort measure, but as a necessity. And the smell of the lake in November, cold water and iron, and something ancient, came through all of it. Anyway, Dennis Halvorsen had lived on London Road for 14 years. He had moved there after his wife Carol died of cancer in 1991. Not because the house was familiar, but because it was unfamiliar. A clean start in a place that held none of their shared history. On a street where he could hear the lake at night and be reminded of something larger than grief. He was 52 years old in November 1999, a lean and precise man who kept his business accounts with the same exactness he brought to everything, and who had taken, in the previous year, a cooking class at the Community Education Center because he had decided that living alone was not a reason to eat badly. The cooking class had produced a spiral-bound notebook of recipes, handwritten in the instructor's neat print, supplemented by Dennis's own notes in the margins, adjustments for altitude, substitutions for ingredients the Duluth Co-op didn't carry, observations like needs more time and have the cream if making for one. He cooked from it every Friday evening. It was his weekly ritual, his private indulgence. The thing he did for himself because he believed that an act done with care had value regardless of whether anyone else was there to see it. He had told this to his sister Inger, who lived in Eau Claire. She had told it years later to investigators, and later still to a reporter, because it was the kind of thing about a person you want the record to contain. His business partner was Kenneth Voss. They had met in 1988 at a trade association conference and had gone into business together the following year, founding Halvorsen Voss Commercial Printing on Superior Street, a mid-sized operation that served the regional market, business stationery, promotional materials, the municipal contracts that kept the lights on. They had been partners for 11 years. By external measure, the partnership was functional and stable. The business was profitable. Neither man had serious personal conflict with the other. In their arrangement, Dennis handled the finances and client relationships. Voss managed production and vendor contracts, divided their responsibilities cleanly. What Dennis did not know, as of November 1999, was that Kenneth Voss had been quietly liquidating his personal financial obligations for the previous 8 months. He had paid off his mortgage. He had moved savings. He had, in August 1999, retained an attorney to draft a new will for Dennis, presenting himself to the attorney as Dennis's authorized representative using a power of attorney document of contested legitimacy that named Voss as the sole beneficiary of Dennis's interest in the business. The will had been executed in September. Dennis had not signed it. His signature had been provided by other means. Dennis was making white bean soup from the spiral-bound notebook on the evening of November 5, 1999. He had the recipe open on the counter, a half-chopped onion on the cutting board, a pot beginning to heat on the front left burner. He had music on, a classical station, the kind that plays in the background of a quiet Friday evening without demanding attention. He had a glass of wine poured, not yet touched, on the counter near the recipe notebook. Kenneth Voss came to the house on London Road sometime that evening. What happened between the beginning of the soup and 9:47, when Voss called the police, is a sequence that the investigation would spend 25 years attempting to reconstruct. What was known immediately, and what was noted in the first report, the soup had been turned off. The onion was still on the cutting board. The wine was still on the counter. Dennis was gone, and Kenneth Voss had called it in. The Duluth Police Department treated the case as a missing persons investigation from the outset, which was the correct procedural response to what the evidence presented. An adult man, no signs of disturbance, no note, no apparent reason to leave. The duty detective assigned was a woman named Carol Lindvist, no relation to Dennis's late wife, which was a coincidence that struck Inger Halvorsen as the kind of thing that only happens in real life. Lindvist was 40 years old, methodical, and experienced enough to note the soup and the turned-off burner and the wine on the counter and feel a specific unease about them, though she could not immediately articulate what the unease was pointing at. She interviewed Voss that first night. He was calm, cooperative, appropriately concerned. He said Dennis had been under stress recently. Nothing specific, just the general pressure of running a business, a difficult client or two, the Y2K preparations that were consuming everyone's administrative bandwidth that fall. He said Dennis had mentioned once wanting to get away for a while. He said he hoped Dennis had just taken a drive. He said he was sure Dennis would turn up. He said all the right things in the right order. Lindvist noted the will change. She noted it when the attorney who had drafted it contacted the department 2 weeks into the investigation, unsettled by what he had heard, wanting to clarify that he had acted in good faith on documentation presented to him as legitimate. The power of attorney document was examined by a forensic document analyst. The analyst's report was inconclusive. The document was genuine in its physical construction, the signature resembling Dennis's known signature closely enough that fraud could not be definitively established from document examination alone. The will change was suspicious. It was not provable as fraud. It was not enough. Voss inherited Dennis's share of the business in early 2000, after Dennis was legally declared deceased by a Duluth probate court following the mandatory waiting period. The business was reorganized. Voss bought out the remaining interest and continued operating. He did so with the money from Dennis's share, $847,000, the assessed value of Dennis's equity at the time of the partnership dissolution. Lindfist had retired by 2008. She had kept a copy of the case summary in a file at home, not because she expected resolution, but because the soup troubled her. It had troubled her for 9 years when she put the file away. It troubled her when she took it out occasionally in retirement, which she did 3 or 4 times over the following decade, reading through it the way you read through something when you believe the answer is present, but you haven't found the angle yet. The angle, she would later say, was always the soup. She just didn't have what she needed to make it mean something. By 2005, 6 years had passed. Inger Halvorsen drove from Eau Claire to Duluth once a year, on Dennis's birthday in April, to visit the house on London Road, or rather to stand outside it, since she had no right to enter and Kenneth Voss had shown no inclination to invite her. The house had been rented out for 2 years, and then sat empty. Voss had seemed uncertain what to do with it, and the real estate market in Duluth in the early 2000s did not make selling urgent. Inger would stand on the sidewalk and look at the house, and then walk down to the lake and stand there for a while, looking at the water, which was the same water Dennis had looked at from his bedroom window for 14 years. She told an interviewer in 2023 that what sustained her was a specific conviction that had no evidentiary basis. She was certain Dennis had not left voluntarily because Dennis did not do things without finishing them. He was the kind of man who completed what he started. He would not have left a pot on the stove. He would not have left an onion on the cutting board. He would not have left a glass of wine untouched. She said, "You have to understand, the unfinished soup was the evidence. I knew it from the first week. The only question was how to prove it." By 2010, 11 years. Kenneth Voss had sold the printing business in 2007 and retired to a condominium in Duluth's Canal Park neighborhood with a view of the aerial lift bridge. He was 60 years old, comfortable, living well on a foundation built in a wall on London Road. He had remarried in 2004. He attended the annual Superior Business Association dinners. He was, to all visible purposes, a retired businessman living an ordinary retirement. By 2018, the house on London Road had passed through 2 more owners. The second of these, a couple from the Twin Cities who had purchased it as a vacation property, found it harder to maintain than anticipated and listed it for sale in 2023. The buyers, a young family who planned to make it their primary residence, hired a local contractor for a full renovation. The contractor's crew began work in February 2024. The foreman was a man named Pete Ahonen, who had been doing renovation work in Duluth for 20 years, and who had opened walls in enough old houses to have a feel for what belonged there and what didn't. On the 3rd day of work, removing a section of drywall in the basement to run new electrical conduit, he found a section of framing that looked slightly different from the rest. Newer lumber, the fasteners showing less oxidation than the surrounding structure, a cavity that the framing configuration didn't require. He stopped. He took photographs. Then he called the Duluth Police Department. "Every case we build takes weeks of research, records review, and the years families spent refusing to accept silence as an answer. If that work matters to you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from." Now, let's get back to Dennis. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Cold Case Unit assigned Special Agent Sari Korhonen to the Halvorsen case when the Duluth PD flagged the discovery. She was 41 years old, had worked cold cases for 7 years, and had read the Halvorsen file twice in the previous 3 years as part of a systematic review of unsolved Duluth area cases. She had noted the will change. She had noted the power of attorney documentation. She had noted, in Carol Lindfist's original case notes, the question written in the margin beside the description of the stove. Who turned off the burner? The sealed cavity in the basement wall contained a plastic document container of the kind sold at hardware stores for waterproofing important papers. Inside the container, in a condition consistent with 25 years of sealed, temperature-stable storage, Dennis Halvorson's wallet, his watch, a Seiko his sister had given him for his 50th birthday, his house keys, and his cell phone. The Nokia he had often left in the car but which was, on the evening of November 5, 1999, apparently inside the house. And beneath those items, folded once, a single page torn from a yellow legal pad. Handwritten. A list of figures and account numbers and property valuations, with calculations in the margins. The handwriting was Kenneth Voss's, confirmed by forensic document examination against known exemplars from business records. The bottom of the page read, DH share Club $847,000. Transfer complete by Q1 2000. The note was not a confession. It was a plan. Written before the disappearance, hidden after, preserved with the objects taken from a man who had been in the middle of cooking dinner when his partner arrived at the door. DNA evidence recovered from within the sealed cavity, processed by the BCA laboratory, placed Kenneth Voss at the scene with a statistical certainty that the laboratory's report described in the same terms used for every other DNA finding in the series, indistinguishable from zero probability of error. Physical evidence from the cavity, combined with the forensic document analysis and the DNA results, supported the reconstruction of events that Korhonen presented to the MIN. County Attorney's Office in June 2024, Voss had come to the house on November 5, 1999, with the intention he had been planning for 8 months. After Dennis was incapacitated, Voss had turned off the stove. Composed, deliberate, thinking about what the scene should look like, and had secured Dennis's personal effects in the container he had brought for that purpose. He had built the cavity in the basement wall in the days following. He had called the police and reported his partner missing and said the soup burner was off. Like Dennis had just stepped out for a minute. He had been right that it looked like Dennis had stepped out for a minute. He had been counting on that. Kenneth Voss was arrested at his Canal Park condominium on July 8, 2024, by Agent Korhonen and Duluth PD officers. He was 74 years old. He was standing at his kitchen window when they arrived, looking at the aerial lift bridge over the ship canal. He did not speak when they entered. He was charged with first-degree murder. He was held without bail. He entered a guilty plea in November 2024, 25 years and 6 days after Dennis Halvorson had left his soup unfinished. He was sentenced to life without parole. In the sentencing hearing, he made one statement, which his attorney had evidently not been able to dissuade him from making, and which the court transcript records as follows: I turned off the stove so the house wouldn't burn down. The judge looked at him for a moment before responding. She said, The house burned down anyway, Mr. Voss. It just took 25 years. Inger Halvorson was 78 years old at the sentencing. She had driven from Eau Claire and sat in the front row. She had brought the spiral-bound recipe notebook, the cooking class notebook, Dennis's annotations in the margins. Have the cream if making for one, which she had asked for and received from the evidence room after it was released from the original investigation. She held it through the sentencing. When Voss was let out, she did not watch him go. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She said, to the reporter who spoke with her afterward, he believed in doing things carefully, even for himself. Even when no one else was watching. Even on a Friday evening, alone in a house on the lake. He was making soup. He had the recipe open. He had a glass of wine he was about to drink. She said, that's who he was. That's who they took. Dennis Halvorson was 52 years old, He cooked elaborate Friday dinners from a spiral-bound notebook because he believed that a meal made carefully was worth making, even when no one was there to share it. He had handwritten notes in the margins, adjustments, substitutions, observations accumulated over a year of trying. And he had a glass of wine on the counter, and a pot of soup beginning to heat, and a classical station playing in the background of a Friday evening he had every reason to expect would end the way Friday evenings were supposed to end. The house on London Road kept what it knew for 25 years. It kept the wallet and the watch and the keys and the plan written in someone else's hand. It kept the evidence of what had been done and who had done it and what it had been worth. The wall held all of it. Held it through 2 floods and 3 owners and 25 winters of lake weather, until a renovation crew arrived with the right tools and the right angle. The spiral-bound recipe notebook is back with Inger now, in Eau Claire. She has said she is thinking of making the white bean soup. She has said he never got to finish it. Someone should. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has incorporated the Halvorsen case into its training materials on financial motive homicides. Specifically, the section on the evidentiary significance of staged departure scenes. Scenes designed to suggest voluntary absence rather than crime. The training material identifies the turned-off stove burner as the detail that Lindqvist had correctly flagged as anomalous in 1999, and that the case file preserved for 25 years until the physical evidence gave it the context it needed. The material notes victims who live alone, who are orderly in their habits, who are in the middle of a routine task. Do not leave without finishing. That is not proof. But it is a question worth asking, and asking again, and keeping in the file until something answers it. What does it say about the nature of careful planning that Kenneth Voss spent 8 months preparing, remembered to turn off the stove, hid the evidence in a wall, and then kept living in the same city, attending the same dinners, watching the same bridge from his window, and that all of it held for exactly as long as a wall held? Does a guilty plea at 74, after 25 years of a life built on what he took, constitute the justice Dennis Halvorsen was owed, or is that question too clean for what actually happened? And when you think about Inger Halvorsen holding that recipe notebook in the courtroom, the annotations in the margins, the note about having the cream for one, what does it mean that the most ordinary record of a person's private life is sometimes the most complete portrait of who they were? Justice came for Dennis Halvorsen after 25 years. His story, and the story of everything that wall held, reminds us that houses remember and records endure. And a detail noted in a margin and a question written in a case file margin do not disappear simply because nobody answers them for a quarter century. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.